The gunshot that killed Sarah Mendoza's father echoed through the dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona Territory, on a scorching afternoon in July 1881, and she learned in that moment that tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. She stood in the doorway of their modest home, watching the sheriff and his deputy carry her father's body away on a canvas stretcher, his blood staining the fabric in dark blooms that spread like poisonous flowers. Her mother had died 3 years prior from scarlet fever, and now at 21 years old, Sarah found herself utterly alone in a town that chewed up the weak and spat them out into unmarked graves on Boot Hill. Her father had owned a small freight business, hauling supplies between Tombstone and the surrounding mining camps, but his murder had been no random act of violence. He had witnessed something he should not have seen, something involving the Clanton gang and their cattle-rustling operation, and he had made the fatal mistake of speaking about it in the Oriental Saloon after too many whiskeys. Sarah knew all this because her father had come home that night 3 weeks ago, pale and shaking, and told her they might need to leave Tombstone. But he had waited too long, thought too much about the business he had built from nothing, and now he was dead. The funeral was sparsely attended. Sarah stood beside the pine coffin in her black dress, her face composed as stone, her eyes dry as the desert wind that whipped around the cemetery. People whispered their condolences, but she barely heard them. She was too busy calculating how much money remained in her father's strongbox, whether she could sell the freight wagons and the team of horses, whether she could make it to California where her aunt lived in Sacramento. But even as she planned her escape, she knew the Clantons would not let her leave quietly. Her father had told her what he had seen, and that made her a liability. She refused to cry at the graveside. She refused to cry when she returned to the empty house and saw her father's pipe still resting on the table beside his chair. She refused to cry when she sorted through his belongings and found the letters he had written to her mother during their courtship, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Crying was surrender, and Sarah Mendoza had been raised to be strong. Her father had taught her to shoot, to ride, to keep accounts, to stand tall when men tried to diminish her. She would honor his memory by surviving. 2 days after the funeral, a cowboy appeared at her door. He was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of summer sky. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing sandy brown hair that needed cutting. His clothes were dusty from travel, and he wore a Colt revolver on his hip with the ease of a man who knew how to use it. "Miss Mendoza," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My name is James Garrett. I worked for your father last year hauling freight up to the silver camps. I just heard about what happened, and I wanted to pay my respects. Your father was a good man, one of the best I ever worked for." Sarah studied him from behind the partially closed door, her hand resting on the small pistol she now kept in her apron pocket. "Thank you for your condolences, Mr. Garrett. If you are looking for work, I am afraid I will be selling the business." "I am not looking for work," James said, meeting her gaze directly. "I am looking to help. Word around town is that the Clantons are not finished with your family, that they are worried about what your father might have told you before he died. I figured you could use someone watching your back." "I can take care of myself," Sarah said, her voice hard. "I do not doubt that," James replied. "But even the strongest person needs allies sometimes. Your father helped me once when I was down on my luck, gave me work when no one else would. I owe him a debt, and I would like to repay it by making sure his daughter stays safe." Sarah wanted to refuse him, to send him away and prove that she needed no one. But she was not a fool, and she recognized that James Garrett might be the difference between survival and a bullet in the back. "Very well," she said, opening the door wider. "You can sleep in the barn. There is not much money for food, but I can manage one more mouth for a few days." "I have my own supplies," James said, "and I will earn my keep. Those wagons of your father's need repair work, and the horses need proper tending. If you are going to sell the business, best to get top dollar for it." Over the following days, James proved to be a man of his word. He worked from dawn until dusk, repairing wagon wheels, replacing worn harnesses, and caring for the horses with a gentle competence that surprised Sarah. She watched him from the house, pretending to busy herself with cooking and cleaning, but really trying to understand what kind of man would ride back to Tombstone just to help the daughter of a former employer. He asked for nothing, expected nothing, and worked with a quiet determination that reminded her painfully of her father. On the fourth day, the trouble she had been expecting finally arrived. 3 men rode up to the house in the late afternoon, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the still air like a curtain. Sarah recognized Billy Clanton immediately, along with 2 of his associates, hard-eyed men who killed as easily as they breathed. James was working on a wagon wheel near the barn, but he straightened when he saw the riders, his hand moving casually to rest near his revolver. "Miss Mendoza," Billy Clanton called out, not bothering to dismount. "I heard you have been asking questions around town about your father's death." "That is not wise. Your father's business is done and buried with him. Best you leave it that way." Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her spine straight, her face emotionless. "I have asked no questions, Mr. Clanton. I have been preparing to leave Tombstone, nothing more." "Glad to hear it," Billy said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Just wanted to make sure we understood each other. Would hate for anything unfortunate to happen to a pretty young woman like yourself." The threat hung in the air, as palpable as the heat. Sarah felt rage building inside her chest, a burning fury that wanted to explode outward, but she kept her expression neutral. "Your message is received. Now please leave my property." Billy's eyes shifted to James, who had moved closer to the house. "Who is your friend?" "Just a hired hand," Sarah said quickly. "He is helping me prepare the business for sale." "Funny," Billy said. "I heard James Garrett was working up in Colorado territory, long way to come for a little repair work." His hand drifted toward his gun, and his companions did the same. The moment stretched tight as a bowstring. "I go where the work is," James said calmly, "and right now I am working here. If you have business with Miss Mendoza, state it plain, otherwise you are trespassing." For a long moment no one moved, then Billy laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "No business today, just a friendly visit. You folks have a pleasant evening." He wheeled his horse around and his men followed. But as they rode away, Billy called back over his shoulder, "Remember what I said, Miss Mendoza. Some things are better left buried." When they were out of sight, Sarah's legs began to tremble. She gripped the porch railing, willing herself to remain standing, to remain composed. James climbed the steps and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling evening air. "You need to leave Tombstone," he said quietly. "Tonight if possible, they will be back, and next time they will not just be making threats." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I have known since the moment my father died, but where do I go?" "I have an aunt in Sacramento, but that is more than 600 miles away. I would need supplies, money for the journey. Even if I sell the business, I do not have enough." "Then do not sell it," James said. "Keep the best wagon and the strongest team. I will drive you to California myself. We can carry freight along the way, make enough money to cover our supplies. It will take time, maybe 2 months or more, but it is safer than traveling alone or trying to book passage on a stage where the Clantons have eyes everywhere." Sarah turned to look at him, searching his face for ulterior motives. "Why would you do this? You barely knew my father, you do not know me at all. What could you possibly gain from helping me?" James was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. 3 years ago, I lost my family to a ranch fire. My wife and baby daughter. I was not there when it happened. I was out rounding up cattle in the far pasture. By the time I saw the smoke and rode back, there was nothing left but ashes and memories. Your father gave me work 2 months later when I was ready to put a bullet in my own head. He did not ask questions, did not demand my story, just gave me honest work and treated me with dignity. He saved my life, Miss Mendoza. The least I can do is save his daughters." The raw pain in his voice pierced through Sarah's carefully constructed armor. She saw the grief in his eyes, recognized it because it mirrored her own. But still, she did not cry. She had learned that tears solved nothing, that they were a sign of weakness in a world that preyed on the vulnerable. Instead, she nodded once sharply. "We leave tomorrow at dawn. Pack only what we can defend and what we can sell. The rest stays behind." They worked through the night by lamplight, loading the largest wagon with tools, supplies, and goods that could be traded or sold in the towns along their route. Sarah packed her mother's jewelry, her father's pocket watch, and the bundle of love letters tied with ribbon. Everything else, all the furniture and household items that had made up her life, she abandoned. Just before dawn, they hitched the 4 strongest horses to the wagon and began their journey west, leaving Tombstone behind as the sun broke over the Dragoon Mountains. The first week of travel was exhausting. They followed the southern route toward Tucson, moving slowly because the wagon was heavily loaded. James proved to be an excellent teamster, guiding the horses over rough terrain with patient skill. At night, they camped under the stars, taking turns keeping watch. Sarah cooked their meals over small fires, using the supplies James had wisely insisted they bring. They spoke little during those first days, both of them locked in their own thoughts, processing their grief in the silence of the desert. In Tucson, James sold some of their tools to a mining outfit and took on a contract to haul equipment north to Phoenix. It was out of their way, but the money was good, and they needed every cent for the long journey ahead. Sarah watched him negotiate, impressed by his quiet confidence and his refusal to be cheated. He treated her as an equal partner in their venture, asking her opinion on which contracts to take and how to spend their earnings. As they traveled north through the scorching Arizona territory in August, the landscape became increasingly harsh. The temperature soared above 100 degrees most days, and water was scarce. They rationed carefully, stopping at every creek and spring to refill their barrels. Sarah had never experienced such hardship. Her life in Tombstone, while not luxurious, had been comfortable. Now her hands blistered from work, her skin burned despite the bonnet she wore, and her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, but she did not complain. She did not cry. She simply endured, day after day, mile after mile. James watched her with growing admiration. He had expected her to break, to demand they turn back or find an easier way. But Sarah Mendoza was forged from the same tough steel as her father, and she met every challenge with grim determination. She learned to harness the horses, to repair broken wagon wheels, to shoot accurately with the rifle he taught her to handle. At night, when they sat by the fire, he found himself talking to her about his past, about his wife Maria and their daughter Elena, about the ranch he had built with his own hands and watched burn to the ground. Sarah listened without judgment, without offering empty platitudes. She understood that grief was not something to be fixed or hurried through, but rather a weight to be carried until it gradually became bearable. In return, she began to share her own stories about her mother's illness and death, about her father's stubborn pride and gentle humor, about her dreams of seeing the ocean someday. They reached Phoenix in early September and picked up another freight contract heading west toward Yuma. The money was accumulating slowly, but it was enough to keep them fed and supplied. More importantly, they were putting distance between themselves and the Clantons, moving deeper into territory where Billy and his gang had no reach. Somewhere along the trail between Phoenix and Yuma, something shifted between them. Sarah could not pinpoint the exact moment, but she began to notice small things. The way James always made sure she had the softest spot to sleep, using his own saddle as a pillow for her. The way he smiled when she successfully shot a rabbit for their dinner. The way his hand lingered when he helped her down from the wagon. And she realized, with a start that left her feeling unbalanced, that she looked forward to their evening conversations more than anything else in her day. James was falling in love with her, though he tried to hide it. Sarah was 21, strong and beautiful despite the hardships of travel, with dark hair and eyes that held depths of sorrow and strength. She was nothing like his Maria had been, Maria who had been soft and gentle and needed protecting. Sarah was fierce and independent, a survivor who would bend but never break. He found himself watching her when she was not looking, marveling at her resilience, wanting to make her smile because her smiles were so rare and precious. But he held back, unsure if his feelings were welcome. She had been through so much, lost so much. The last thing she needed was unwanted advances from a man she depended on for protection. So he kept his distance, remaining friendly but proper, and tried to ignore the growing ache in his chest whenever she was near. They reached Yuma in late September, and James secured their most lucrative contract yet, hauling supplies to a new mining camp in the mountains east of San Diego. It would take them through some of the most dangerous territory in the West, land where Apache raiding parties still operated and where bandits preyed on travelers. But the payment would be enough to get Sarah safely to Sacramento with money to spare for starting a new life. "Are you certain we should take this risk?" Sarah asked as they prepared to leave Yuma. "We have enough money to reach California. Perhaps we should take the safer route." James checked the wagon's wheels, then straightened to look at her. "The safer route adds 3 weeks to our journey, and winter will be coming to the mountain passes. This way is faster, and I will keep you safe. I promise you that, Sarah." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I trust you," she said softly, and realized it was true. Somewhere along the dusty miles, James Garrett had become more than just her protector or business partner. He had become someone she relied on, someone she cared about in ways she was only beginning to understand. The journey east from Yuma was treacherous. They climbed into rocky foothills, following narrow trails that wound through canyons and over ridges. The heat persisted despite the altitude, and the landscape was unforgiving. On the 5th day out of Yuma, they encountered a band of Apache warriors on a ridge above their trail. James immediately pulled the wagon to a halt and raised his hand in a peaceful gesture. "Stay calm," he murmured to Sarah. "Do not reach for a weapon unless I tell you to." The Apache descended from the ridge, 6 warriors on horseback, their faces painted and their weapons ready. Their leader, a man in his 30s with a scar running down his left cheek, rode forward to examine them. He spoke in Apache, then switched to broken English. "You cross our land," he said. "What you carry?" "Mining supplies," James answered. "Tools and equipment for the camps near San Diego. We mean no disrespect to your people. We are simply trying to make a living." The Apache leader studied them for a long moment, his gaze lingering on Sarah. "You have woman, she your wife." "She is under my protection," James said carefully. The warrior smiled slightly. "She is strong. I see it in her eyes. You are lucky man." He gestured to his companions and they lowered their weapons. "We let you pass, but leave gift, food or tools, your choice." James glanced at Sarah, who nodded. They could spare some supplies. He climbed down and selected a bag of cornmeal, some jerked beef, and a box of ammunition that would fit the Henry rifle one of the warriors carried. The Apache leader accepted the gifts with a nod of approval. "Safe travels," he said, "but move fast. White men's war coming to these mountains. Much blood will spill soon." As the Apache rode away, Sarah released a breath she had not realized she was holding. That could have gone very differently. "Yes," James agreed, climbing back onto the wagon seat. "We were fortunate. He was right about one thing, though. You are strong, stronger than anyone I have ever known." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "I am only doing what I must to survive." "No," James said, snapping the reins to get the horses moving again. "Survival is about staying alive. What you are doing is something more. You are building a new life from the ruins of the old one. That takes courage, not just strength." They reached the mining camp 3 days later and delivered their supplies without incident. The camp foreman paid them in gold coin, and James immediately purchased supplies for the final leg of their journey to California. They would follow the trails west through the mountains, cross into California near San Diego, then head north along the coast to Los Angeles before turning inland towards Sacramento. If all went well, they would reach Sarah's aunt by late October. But all did not go well. They were 2 days west of the mining camp, traveling through a narrow canyon, when the axle on their wagon cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon lurched violently, throwing Sarah from her seat. James grabbed her before she could fall completely, pulling her against him as he fought to control the panicking horses. The wagon tilted dangerously, threatening to overturn, but James managed to bring the team to a halt just before disaster struck. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his arms still around Sarah. "No, I am fine," she said, though her heart was pounding. She became suddenly aware of how close they were, of his hands on her waist, of his face inches from hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then James released her and climbed down to inspect the damage. The axle was split nearly through, and the wagon could not continue without repairs. James assessed their situation with growing concern. They were at least a day's ride from the nearest town, and they were carrying too many supplies to transport on horseback. Worse, storm clouds were gathering on the western horizon, the first signs of the autumn rains that could turn the canyon into a death trap. "We will have to camp here while I make repairs," James said. "It will take me most of tomorrow to cut and shape a new axle from one of the spare timbers. If the rain holds off, we should be able to move out by the following morning." Sarah looked at the darkening sky and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "And if the rain does not hold off, then we will deal with it," James said with more confidence than he felt. They made camp in the lee of a large boulder that offered some protection from the wind. James worked until dark, using his axe to shape a replacement axle from the spare lumber they carried. Sarah prepared a meal and tended to the horses, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that prickled at the back of her neck. The canyon felt oppressive, the walls looming above them like the sides of a grave. That night the rain began. It started as a light drizzle, but within an hour it had become a steady downpour. James rigged a canvas tarp over their camp, but water soon began pooling around them. They huddled together under the tarp, listening to the rain hammer against the canvas and watching the dry creek bed in the center of the canyon begin to fill with water. "James," Sarah said quietly, her voice tight with worry, "that water is rising fast." He had been thinking the same thing. Flash floods were a deadly reality in these desert canyons, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. "We need to move to higher ground. Now." They worked frantically in the darkness, unhitching the horses and leading them up the canyon wall to a shelf of rock about 15 feet above the canyon floor. The horses balked at the steep climb, but James and Sarah pushed and pulled until all 4 animals were safely on the shelf. Then they began hauling up their most essential supplies: the food, the weapons, the strongbox containing their money, and Sarah's small bundle of personal belongings. They had just finished when they heard it, a roar like an approaching train. James grabbed Sarah and pulled her tight against the canyon wall as a wall of water surged through the canyon below them, a churning mass of mud and debris that would have swept them away instantly if they had still been at ground level. The wagon, which they had not been able to move, was picked up by the flood and smashed against the canyon wall, exploding into splinters. Sarah watched their livelihood destroyed in seconds, watched weeks of work and all their remaining supplies vanish into the raging torrent. And something inside her finally broke. The careful control she had maintained since her father's death, the iron will that had kept her tears locked away, suddenly shattered like glass. A sob tore from her throat, raw and agonizing, and then she was crying, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She tried to stop, tried to force the tears back, but they kept coming. All the grief she had been holding inside, all the fear and pain and exhaustion, poured out of her in a flood as unstoppable as the water raging below them. She sank to the ground, her hands covering her face, ashamed of her weakness but unable to contain it. James knelt beside her and pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. "Let it out," he said gently, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flood. "I am here, let it out, Sarah." And she did. She cried for her father, murdered in the street. She cried for her mother, lost to fever. She cried for her home, abandoned in the night. She cried for the life she had planned, the dreams that had died with her parents. And finally, she cried for herself, for the frightened young woman who had been pretending to be strong when inside she was terrified and alone. James held her through it all, one hand cradling her head against his shoulder, the other rubbing slow circles on her back. He did not tell her to stop crying or to be strong. He did not offer empty reassurances. He simply held her and let her grieve, providing the safe space she had needed all along but been too proud to seek. When her tears finally subsided, Sarah remained in his arms, too exhausted to move. The rain continued to fall, but more gently now, and the roar of the floodwater was receding as the surge passed through the canyon. "I am sorry," Sarah whispered hoarsely. "I should not have fallen apart like that. You have nothing to apologize for," James said firmly. "You have been carrying more weight than anyone should have to bear, and you have done it without complaint for months. But grief is not weakness, Sarah. Tears are not surrender. They are just proof that you are human, that you loved deeply and lost much. There is no shame in that." Sarah pulled back slightly to look up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "I have been so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if I started crying, I would never stop. Afraid that if I showed any weakness, the world would swallow me whole." "The world might try," James said, reaching up to brush a strand of wet hair from her face. "But I will not let it. I will stand beside you for as long as you need me, Sarah, for as long as you will have me." There was something in his voice, a depth of emotion that went beyond friendship or duty. Sarah searched his face in the darkness, seeing the truth written in his eyes. "James," she whispered, "what are you saying?" "I am saying that I love you," James said simply. "I think I have loved you since the day you stood on your porch and faced down Billy Clanton without flinching. I love your strength and your courage. I love the way you refuse to give up no matter how hard things get. I love the sound of your laugh, which I have only heard twice but would give anything to hear again. I am not asking you to love me back. I know it is too soon after all you have lost, but I needed you to know that you are not alone. You will never be alone as long as I draw breath." Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding. She thought about the past months, about the way he had protected her and respected her, about the way he made her feel safe and valued. She thought about how much she had come to depend on him, not just for physical protection but for companionship and understanding. And she realized that somewhere along the dusty trails between Arizona and California, she had fallen in love with him too. "It is not too soon," she said softly. "I love you too, James. I think I have been falling in love with you mile by mile, day by day, but I was too afraid to admit it. I have lost everyone I ever loved, and I was terrified of loving again, of risking that kind of pain. But you are right. Grief is not weakness, and neither is love. Love is the bravest thing we can do." James cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and salt tears, a kiss that spoke of sorrow survived and hope rediscovered. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling despite the disaster that surrounded them. They spent the rest of the night huddled together on the rock shelf, wrapped in James's coat and each other's arms, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, they surveyed the damage. The wagon was gone, along with most of their supplies and all the freight they had been hauling. But they still had the horses, their weapons, and the strong box of money. More importantly, they had each other. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, looking at the muddy devastation below. "We ride," James said. "We have enough money to buy supplies in the next town, and we have 4 good horses. We can reach Los Angeles in a week if we push hard, maybe less. From there, we can decide whether to continue to Sacramento or make a new start somewhere else. The choice is yours, Sarah." Sarah thought about her aunt in Sacramento, a woman she barely remembered from childhood. She thought about running to family out of obligation rather than desire. And then she thought about the man standing beside her, the man who had become her family through choice rather than blood. "Let's go to Los Angeles," she said. "I hear there are opportunities there for people willing to work hard. Maybe we could start a freight business of our own, something we build together. And someday, when we are established, we can travel north to visit my aunt and let her know I am well. But I do not want to run anymore, James. I want to build something new with you." James smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in weeks. "Then that is what we will do, together." They descended from the shelf, as soon as the ground was solid enough to navigate, loaded their remaining supplies onto 2 of the horses, and began riding west. The journey to Los Angeles took 9 days of hard riding. They followed the trails through the mountains and down into the coastal valleys, where the air was soft and smelled of sage and ocean. The landscape was greener here, less harsh than the Arizona desert, and Sarah felt something loosen in her chest as they rode through rolling hills dotted with oak trees. They reached Los Angeles in mid-October 1881, entering the small but growing town that was beginning to attract settlers from across the country. The population was less than 12,000, but the town hummed with energy and possibility. James and Sarah found a modest boarding house run by a kind widow named Mrs. Chen, who asked few questions and charged reasonable rates. Over the next weeks, they set about building their new life. James found work with a local freight company, learning the routes and customers while Sarah kept the books and managed their finances. They saved every penny they could, living frugally but contentedly. In the evenings, they would walk through the town, making plans for their future, discussing the kind of freight business they wanted to build. On a cool November evening, as they walked along the bluff overlooking the ocean, James stopped and turned to face Sarah. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore provided a gentle rhythm to the moment. "Sarah Mendoza," he said, taking her hand in his. "We have been through hell together, you and I. We have faced death and loss and disaster. But through it all, you have been my strength, my reason for keeping going. I do not have much to offer you right now, no fancy house or comfortable life, but I can promise you my loyalty, my protection, and my love for as long as we both live. Will you marry me?" Sarah felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, James, I will marry you. You have given me more than you know. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me a reason to believe in the future again. I love you with all my heart." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the local church, with Mrs. Chen and her husband standing as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she had purchased with some of their savings, and James wore his cleanest shirt and a new vest. They had no family present, but they did not need anyone else. They were each other's family now, bound by love and shared survival. The newlyweds rented a small house on the outskirts of town, a modest structure with 2 rooms and a kitchen. It was not much, but it was theirs, the first home either of them had truly owned since their losses. James built furniture in the evenings and Sarah planted a garden in the small yard. They worked side by side during the days, saving money and building their reputation in the freight business. By the spring of 1882, they had saved enough to purchase their own wagon and team. James Garrett Freight Company officially opened for business in April, with Sarah as the business manager and James as the lead driver. They started small, taking contracts that the larger companies did not want, hauling supplies to remote ranches and small settlements in the hills outside Los Angeles. But they were reliable and honest, and word spread quickly. Within 6 months, they had 3 wagons operating and had hired 2 additional drivers. Sarah proved to have a brilliant head for business. She negotiated contracts with the shrewdness of a veteran trader, balanced the books with meticulous accuracy, and managed their growing operation with confident efficiency. James watched her bloom with pride, seeing her transform from a grief-stricken refugee to a successful businesswoman. But what he treasured most were the quiet moments they shared at home, the evenings spent talking by the fireplace, the mornings waking up beside her, the simple joy of building a life together. In the fall of 1882, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with a complex mixture of joy and fear. James remembered too well the loss of his first child, and Sarah worried about whether she could manage a baby while running the business. But as her pregnancy progressed, their fears gave way to excited anticipation. Their son was born in May of 1883, a healthy baby boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Thomas, after Sarah's father, and Samuel, after James's father. Little Thomas was a colicky baby who kept them up many nights, but neither parent minded the exhaustion. He was proof that life continued, that love could create something beautiful even in the aftermath of tragedy. Sarah took 3 months away from the business to care for Thomas, but by August she was back at work, with the baby in a cradle beside her desk. Mrs. Chen's daughter, a young woman named Lynn, agreed to help care for Thomas during the days, and the arrangement worked well. The freight business continued to grow, expanding to include contracts with the Southern Pacific Railroad, which was extending its lines throughout Southern California. By 1885, James Garrett Freight Company was one of the most successful operations in Los Angeles, with 8 wagons, a dozen employees, and contracts throughout the region. James and Sarah purchased a larger house, a beautiful home with a view of the distant ocean and enough room for their growing family. Their daughter, Elena Maria, was born in September of 1885, named for James's lost daughter and Sarah's mother. Elena was a happy baby, all smiles and laughter, and Thomas adored his little sister with the fierce protectiveness of a loving older brother. Life was not without challenges. The freight business was competitive and sometimes dangerous, with accidents and equipment failures and difficult customers. There were months when money was tight and months when they wondered if they had taken on too much. But Sarah and James faced every challenge together, their partnership strengthened by the trials they had already survived. In the summer of 1886, 5 years after fleeing Tombstone, Sarah received a letter from her aunt in Sacramento. It had taken years to find her, but the aunt had finally tracked down her niece through business records. She wrote that she had feared Sarah dead and expressed overwhelming relief to learn she was alive and thriving. She begged Sarah to visit, to bring her family north so she could meet them. Sarah and James talked it over and decided to make the journey. By now, they could afford to leave the business in the hands of their competent managers for a few weeks. In August, they loaded their children into a comfortable carriage and began the journey north along the California coast. It was nothing like the desperate flight from Arizona 5 years earlier. This time, they traveled in comfort and safety, stopping at fine hotels and enjoying the scenery. Sarah's aunt, Margaret Mendoza, was a widow in her 60s who lived in a comfortable home in Sacramento. She wept when she saw Sarah, embracing her niece and crying over how much she looked like her mother. She doted on Thomas and Elena, spoiling them with candy and toys. Over 2 weeks, Sarah shared the story of what had happened in Tombstone, about her father's murder and her desperate journey west. Margaret listened with tears streaming down her face, grieving for her brother but thankful that his daughter had survived. "Your father would be so proud of you," Margaret said one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the children play in the yard. "You have built such a beautiful life from such terrible circumstances, and you found a good man, a man who clearly treasures you." Sarah smiled, watching James chase Thomas around the garden while carrying Elena on his shoulders. "I found the best man. He saved my life in more ways than one. I do not think I would have survived without him. Love has a way of finding us when we need it most," Margaret said wisely. Your mother used to say that love was the only thing that made the hardships of life bearable. I think she was right. They returned to Los Angeles at the end of August, promising to visit Sacramento again the following year. But as they traveled south, Sarah realized that Sacramento no longer felt like home. Home was Los Angeles, the business they had built, the house they had made together, the life they shared. She had fled Tombstone in fear, but she had found her true home not in a place, but in the family she and James had created. The years that followed were good ones. The freight business continued to prosper, adapting as Los Angeles grew from a small town into a bustling city. James and Sarah expanded into new ventures, purchasing warehouses and investing in real estate. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Grace in 1888 and another son named David in 1890. Their home was always filled with noise and laughter, with the chaos of raising 4 children and managing a growing business empire. Sarah never forgot the lessons she had learned on that desperate journey from Arizona. She never forgot what it felt like to lose everything, to be alone and afraid. And because she remembered, she made sure to help others who found themselves in similar circumstances. She became known for giving jobs to people down on their luck, for offering credit to those who were struggling, for showing the same compassion that James had shown her all those years ago. James continued to drive freight wagons well into his 50s, refusing to give up the work he loved even when he could afford to retire. He said he needed the physical labor to stay grounded, to remember where he came from. But Sarah knew the real reason. He loved the freedom of the open road, the satisfaction of honest work, the simple pleasure of guiding a team of horses through the California landscape he had come to love. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1901, James and Sarah took a trip back to Tombstone. They had not been back since their flight in 1881, and they were curious to see how the town had changed. Tombstone was quieter now, the silver mines mostly played out, the lawless days of the Clanton gang long past. They visited the cemetery where Sarah's father was buried, and Sarah finally allowed herself to cry again, not with the desperate grief of 20 years earlier, but with the bittersweet sorrow of remembering someone deeply loved and forever lost. "Thank you, Papa," she whispered, placing wildflowers on the grave. "Thank you for teaching me to be strong, for giving me the courage to survive. I hope I have made you proud." James put his arm around her shoulders as they stood beside the grave. "He would be incredibly proud, Sarah. Look at everything you have accomplished, everything you have built. You honored his memory by living a full and beautiful life." They stayed in Tombstone for 3 days, walking the streets where Sarah had grown up, visiting the places that held memories both painful and precious. And then they left, returning to Los Angeles and the life they had built together, carrying their memories but no longer haunted by them. As the new century progressed, James and Sarah began gradually stepping back from the day-to-day operations of their business, turning over more responsibilities to their children. Thomas had proven to be a natural leader, taking over as the company's president in 1905. Alina had married a lawyer and lived in San Francisco, but she remained involved in the business as a financial advisor. Grace and David were both still in school, but they showed every sign of inheriting their parents' business acumen and work ethic. In 1910, at the age of 50 and 51 respectively, James and Sarah retired from active business operations. They had more money than they could ever spend, a beautiful home, 4 successful children, and a growing brood of grandchildren. They spent their retirement traveling, visiting all the places Sarah had dreamed of seeing when she was young. They went to San Francisco and saw the rebuilding after the great earthquake. They traveled to New York and marveled at the tall buildings and crowded streets. They even took a ship to Europe and spent 6 months touring England, France, and Italy. But they always returned to Los Angeles, to the home they had built together, to the life they cherished. And every evening, they would sit on their porch, holding hands and watching the sun set over the ocean, grateful for every moment they had been given, grateful for the love that had saved them both. On a warm evening in June 1925, Sarah sat on the porch watching the sunset, as she had done thousands of times before. James was beside her, his hair now completely white, his face lined with age but his eyes still the same clear blue that had first captured her heart 44 years earlier. Their children and grandchildren had gathered for a family celebration, filling the house with noise and laughter. But for this moment, it was just the two of them, together as they had been through everything life had thrown at them. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked softly. "Giving up your life to help a stranger all those years ago," James squeezed her hand and smiled. "Not for a single moment. You were never a stranger, Sarah. From the moment I saw you standing on that porch, refusing to let your grief break you, I knew you were going to be the most important person in my life. Helping you, loving you, building this life with you, it has been my greatest honor and my deepest joy." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength that had supported her for more than 4 decades. "I love you, James Garrett. Thank you for holding me when I needed to cry, for standing beside me when I needed to be strong, for loving me through all of it. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. And you gave me a reason to live when I thought mine was finished," James replied. "We saved each other, Sarah, and we built something beautiful together." As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Sarah reflected on the long journey from that terrible day in Tombstone to this perfect moment in Los Angeles. She thought about the frightened young woman who had refused to cry, who had been so determined to appear strong that she had almost broken under the weight of her own grief. And she thought about the cowboy who had seen through her armor to the hurting person beneath, who had given her permission to be vulnerable, who had held her and said the words she needed to hear. "Let it out, I'm here." Those words had changed everything. They had opened the door to healing, to love, to a future she had not believed possible. And now, 44 years later, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built, Sarah understood that true strength was not about refusing to cry or never showing weakness. True strength was about letting yourself be vulnerable with someone you trusted, about accepting help when you needed it, about building something beautiful from the ruins of tragedy. James Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1927, at the age of 73. He died the way he had lived, quietly and with dignity, causing as little fuss as possible. Sarah held his hand as he took his last breath, and this time she did not hold back her tears. She cried openly, freely, grieving the loss of her partner and best friend. But even through her grief, she felt grateful. Grateful for the 46 years they had shared, grateful for the love that had sustained her through so much, grateful that he had died peacefully, surrounded by family in the home they had built together. Sarah lived for another 12 years, remaining active and engaged until the end. She continued to be involved in the freight company, now run by her grandchildren, and she divided her time between Los Angeles and Sacramento, where she had finally grown close to her extended family. She traveled, she wrote her memoirs, she spoiled her great-grandchildren, and she treasured every day she had been given. She passed away in the spring of 1939 at the age of 79, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were about James, about how much she loved him and how grateful she was that he had found her all those years ago in Tombstone. And as she closed her eyes for the final time, she was smiling, ready to be reunited with the cowboy who had held her when she cried, who had stood beside her through everything, who had loved her with a devotion that lasted beyond death itself. They buried her beside James in a beautiful cemetery overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the ocean she had dreamed of seeing as a young woman fleeing for her life across the Arizona desert. On their shared headstone, their children inscribed the words that best captured their parents' love story. Together through everything, now and always. And in the years that followed, their descendants would tell the story of Sarah and James, The young woman who had lost everything and the cowboy who had helped her find her way again, who had given her permission to grieve and the strength to love again, whose love had created a legacy that would endure for generations. It was a story of tragedy transformed into triumph, of grief giving way to joy, of two broken people who had found each other and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. It was a love story forged in the Wild West, tempered by hardship and proved true by time. And it all began with a simple act of compassion, a strong man telling a hurting woman the words she desperately needed to hear. "Let it out, I'm here."